All right. So I hope everyone started into 2018 well, like I did. I'm very excited for 2018. First topic I want to talk about is it was a question about why should I use NIRS instead of heart rate, and should I use heart rate and NIRS together? I think it's a great question because heart rates, a lot of people use heart rate. Everyone knows heart rate, even like a kind of a low-end general fitness idea. People understand what the parameter is, or they think they understand. They have a concept of what's going on. And it's very easy to use and it's inexpensive, which are all good things. Now, from ease of use, NIRS is making huge bounds. So I use the Moxie monitor, so it's small, it's portable, it's non-invasive. It's definitely getting there. So I think the difference between the pragmatic application of the two, of heart rate and of NIRS, it's getting much closer together. There's still some pricing differences, so there's reasons why heart rate is at the moment still for most people a preferred tool, but I think that gap is closing rapidly. So as to the advantages of why would you use NIRS over heart rate, so muscle oxygenation over heart rate, well, to understand that, we need to understand, well, why are we even measuring heart rate in the first place? Most assessments you do, fitness assessments, don't really have anything to do with heart rate. They have to do with parameters that talk about oxygen supply and demand. So VO2, or then the lactate testing where we talk about aerobic, anaerobic thresholds, things like that. So generally we think about oxygen when we think about fitness and when we think about fitness testing and assessments. And heart rate is really just a surrogate that we use because it's easy to use to somehow then take that tested measure and put it into a training scheme. And it makes sense. So heart rate has to do with this, with the idea of oxygen supply. The heart pumps blood, which supplies oxygen to the muscle, and heart rate is one of those components of the pumping of the blood. The other one being stroke volume, so how hard your muscle actually beats every time when in your heart rate. So, and because NIRS essentially does that as well, it talks about oxygen supply and demand in the muscle. The supply side of that relationship, heart rate is part of that supply side. So NIRS actually opens up the picture much bigger, and it includes not only heart rate as supply side, but also stroke volume, pulmonary functions, things like that. Those are all coming together to create the supply input into what NIRS is looking at in the relationship between supply and demand. That's why there's also, they go together in many ways. If I do high intensity work, my heart rate goes up really high and my muscle oxygenation drops. It makes sense that there's some relationship between those. It'd be weird if it wasn't. So that those things play together really well. Now, essentially NIRS does a more in-depth view of what you're trying to do with heart rate. And it reacts much quicker because it's not only looking at the supply side, but also at the demand side. So when you start training, you start a run, you start activity, you will notice that muscle oxygenation, the dynamics start much quicker, whereas you often have a delay in heart rate. And this is an advantage of NIRS, especially when you're doing short bouts of intensity, of exercise, because you get a NIRS dynamics. You see what's happening. Demand goes way up, supply is lagging. The supply is lagging. We see that in the heart rate because there's a lag. So in essence, heart rate becomes impeded by a lot of changes in intensity. And that's why heart rate is often not used in HIIT or in interval trainings, because it's just not that useful, whereas NIRS is very useful. Now, if we go to endurance training, it becomes a little bit different because it's steady state. So things kind of, they roll up into, and then you kind of remain the same, which also makes heart rate much more useful for steady state training. And the difference between how you would then apply your NIRS data to how you would apply your heart rate data doesn't become that much different. You're trying to find some kind of steady state. It becomes more different in how you want to assess the steady state. Your heart rate's not going to be as useful to make certain physiological assessments of the steady state, whereas your NIRS data might help you more with there. But the difference definitely in endurance training isn't quite as high. To kind of an overview as to what the difference is and as to why you prefer NIRS. Now, would you use NIRS and heart rate? Yes and no. It becomes more of a philosophical question, like what do you want to measure and what is everything that you want to measure? The more things you measure, the bigger the picture you have, the more puzzle pieces you have to understand why you have performance X. The disadvantage just becomes a data battle. What are you going to do? You're going to actually assess all the data. You're going to look at all the data. How are you going to deal with all the data? And that's a problem for athletes and coaches because just collecting data, and if you don't do anything with the data, you might as well not collect it. You need to pick the data that you want to collect that you're actually going to use to look at, like, well, how am I going to change my training? What did my training do? Is my training effective? That's the data you want. And adding more things to that data pool only helps if you're actually going to use the data, and if the data adds more information for the given amount of time it takes to add that data and to assess that data. So it becomes kind of, for me, an efficiency question. Is adding heart rate to your NIRS data going to give you more actual information or not? And especially, is it going to give you more information for the amount of time you need to allocate to then also interpreting that heart rate data. And people have to decide that on their own. People with more time and like it may be more willing to do it. And if you don't like doing it, well, then maybe you should pick one of the two. That includes for adding any kind of data. You can add tons of data information, lots of different physiology. You can start adding, well, I'm going to do EMG at the same time. There's some pretty nice wireless EMG tools you can use. Are you actually going to go through with that data, and is it going to help you? That's something people have to ask themselves. And I think for most people, it's not worthwhile. EMG, for example. I think heart rate and NIRS data, they go together pretty well. It's not too complicated, and heart rate's really easy to collect. So in many cases, I think, sure, why not? You can do both. I don't think heart rate actually gives you that much of a win for the interpretation, for the amount of explanation it's going to give you, like increased explanation. But it's really easy to do. So that's an argument for doing it. What I feel much more relevant is having your NIRS data and having performance data. I think that's really important. Understanding, okay, what is my performance and what is my physiology, and putting those together. I think that's really key. You need both of those things. So somehow getting a performance measure. Cycling is easy. Some kind of power meter with your NIRS is perfect. And I think that explains a lot already, especially when it comes to an applied sports science sense. I hope that helped and answered that question, and we'll have the video up next week again. All right, bye-bye.